So yeah, I love what you say there, Keith, because it really just highlights the interconnectedness of the body, and the fact that, as you say, we can't isolate a organ, glands, or axes if we think about sort of the HPT axes that we've been talking about. Obviously, in our stool test, we look at pancreatic elastase, and you've mentioned that a lot of people who are hypothyroid often will have hypochlorhydria or low stomach acids, which is one of those mechanisms which then impacts on pancreatic elastase or digestive enzymes. But to know that actually there's more of a, I guess, a direct relationship between the thyroid and pancreatic function is just a great example of how we have to be thinking about these things really holistically. But a question that's coming up for me, and I think it's kind of thinking about our listeners listening to this conversation, maybe just, if possible, kind of a very brief summary of what are some of the other signs and symptoms that would indicate that maybe there could be something going on with thyroid function. So maybe things like heart rate, body temperature that could be tracked really easily. And after that, as a result, what are some of the things that you would be looking at in, let's say, a blood test on top of what other practitioners might, like we've mentioned TSH and T4, for example?
Yeah. Okay. So I took a lot of my reading around thyroid, first from Ray Peat and then looking at Broder Barnes's stuff. And Broder Barnes was a researcher, I think it was the 40s, who was saying that you could pretty much diagnose someone's thyroid issue by how much cholesterol they have, and also their basal metabolic rate. Now, I think there are some nuances in that. And if you speak to any doctor, they'll laugh at you for trying to look at metabolic rate and pulse. But I think if you spend some time studying them, you'll realize that there's a pretty credible, albeit crude, relationship between body temperature and pulse. In my master's degree, I did a very small study looking at how a correlation between the thyroid symptoms that you see and a low body temperature, but still the TSH would be relatively normal. So I think it's worth understanding that if you're someone who's prone to cold hands and feet, the lateral third of the eyebrows thinning, you're prone to seasonal affective disorder or kind of changes to your mood when it gets dark and cold. There can be other reasons behind that, behind light, obviously. Changes to digestion. I think it's even useful to state that some females go through a state of subclinical hypothyroidism during their menstrual cycle. If you have such a surge of estrogen, and estrogen can disrupt thyroid hormone function, you can go through this kind of state on a monthly basis. So menstrual cycle irregularities, I think, is something that should be considered. I think the digestive changes, I think sleep can have a huge play on it as well. I think wasting of carbon dioxide, and that's why I think bag breathing and retaining carbon dioxide can be particularly useful. I mean, a lot of people talk about how, say fasting as an example, and calorific restriction is great because it slows metabolism. But ultimately what you end up doing is kind of falling back onto a much less efficient form of physiology. So I think wasting of carbon dioxide can be a particularly interesting feature to consider within low thyroid function. For blood tests, I'm going to say something contentious because I think it really does pay to keep TSH well below 1. And I'll give you my thoughts around that, is that we should be seeing plenty of systemic peripheral conversion of T4 to T3. When that doesn't happen, we fall back upon the pituitary. And pituitary responses, I think, should be perceived as a fallback mechanism, and perhaps even a stress mechanism. We know that at high values of any of the pituitary hormones lend themselves to aging. High TSH is associated with fibrosis, production of interleukins like interleukin 6. High productions of, or chronic production of growth hormone lends itself to both diabetes and cancer, and even kind of chronic production of perhaps the reproductive hormones like or the stimulating hormones like follicle and luteal hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and their effects upon the ovaries or the testicles. When there's chronic production of these hormones, they do have a very negative effect. So perhaps what we should be looking at is minimal pituitary response, rather than kind of looking at these bigger values that we have. And that's something I'm going to be hopefully teasing out within my research. What I want to be looking at is, is there a much better effect of supplementing with T4 and T3 when there's a higher state of pollution and pollutant disrupting effects on thyroid physiology and the feedback loops. And perhaps this might go some way to explain why T4, as an example, isn't appropriate for everyone. Don't get me wrong, it can be very useful for a lot of people, but I think there's a substantial amount of people, and there's a lot of researchers and doctors that might share my view from what I've read, is that T4 and T3, and sometimes T3 on its own could be a much better function. And this is where it comes down to the point that we are subjectively different. We will have different levels of inhibition of thyroid function, whether it's conversion of T4 to T3, whether it's pituitary responses or central nervous system and brain signaling that causes the response. So that there can be very different aspects to what is appropriate for one person and another. But I think this is where we should see a good body temperature of around about 37 degrees. And that's why temperature testing can be particularly useful, because if we're seeing people who are cold, perhaps that's a good suggestion that A, they're not eating enough, or B, their thyroid is not functioning as well as it could be. Equally, could be digestive inflammation that isn't allowing them to process nutrients, and we can still see various temperature changes. And I think as well that there can be another nuance to that, to the extent that someone's been low thyroid for a long period of time and they're into a chronic stress response and their diet one that's just being kind of kept up there by high responses of gluconeogenesis, the need to break down fats and proteins involving glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol. So that's why sometimes if you've got someone that hasn't been eating well, you may actually see their temperature and pulse drop because you've taken them out of their stress response. And I think looking at some of these nuances can be really, really useful, to rather than say, oh, you can't, that person's got normal temperature, so their thyroid must be fine. How long have they been stuck in that stress response for? And that's where a good history and listening to someone is key over and say, okay, here's a TSH test, that looks fine. We are going to go the extra mile. We're taking basal metabolic rate, which actually that might be something slightly different. But if you're looking at kind of body temperature, and as an example, you might see that being in this compensated state.
Brilliant.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, and it really shows us the importance in sort of that holistic, comprehensive approach, and using lots of different markers to try and connect as many of these dots as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And even going back to the stool test, it's like I don't think they're not invaluable. Some people, I stopped using a lot of stool tests a long time ago because I felt you could give some very basic strategies to get people where they want to be. But ultimately, there can be some very difficult clients. They're going to need that kind of extra test because when other things aren't working, you have to have all these kind of fallback mechanisms. But I do believe for a lot of people, once you understand what the thyroid's doing, how much you can change with your nutrition, and perhaps what the environmental and the emotional stresses might be for someone, I think there's a really good window for kind of keeping money in someone's back pocket and getting them to understand what's going on. But sometimes there's a need to fall back on some of the more complex, perhaps reductionist approaches that might just give us some information that we need that we haven't seen yet.
No, absolutely. I agree. I think, those foundational changes, and then we've got numerous tools within the toolkit that we can lean upon if we're not kind of nudging that needle ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Keith,